Hello everyone, and welcome to our class. Glad you can be here and be a part of our study that we're calling Letters Paul Didn't Write. These are letters in our New Testament that were not written by the Apostle Paul. Clearly he wrote most of the epistles in our New Testament, but there are a few that he didn't write. And among them are 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and the letter that we're studying now is Hebrews. And may have left out some there, but we're trying to cover all of them that he didn't write. And today we're going to continue our study of Hebrews, and we're in Hebrews chapter 5. So if you have a Bible with you and would like to turn and follow along, we'll be in Hebrews chapter 5. Just a reminder, as we're working through the book of Hebrews, that the author is writing to a group of people who are undergoing some persecution. He's writing to Jewish people. This book is addressed to Jewish Christians, and as a part of their journey right now, they're having some tough times. They're being persecuted, probably by other Jewish people, because they've kind of left the faith. As Christians, they're kind of being considered as leaving the fold, and people are trying to bring them back in. And in that situation, for many of them, it's just easier to fade back into the religion of Judaism, to observe the things that they observe, and not to make waves. But the author is telling them that it's really important that they stay focused on Jesus, that they keep their eyes on Jesus, they keep their focus and their thoughts on Jesus, and they continue to pursue Him. Because in the first part of the book here, we'll see that the point that he's making here is that Jesus is God's Son. Therefore, Jesus is greater than the law. Jesus is greater than Abraham. Jesus is greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than all of these things. Therefore, to reject Him and turn away from Him would carry with it extraordinary consequences. And you don't want those consequences. And so we're going to continue his thought in chapter 5. Actually, he is continuing with the thought that he started at the end of chapter 4, which is that Jesus is greater than the high priest. He gets into some other things here, and as we get into that, I wanted to kind of think in terms of our lives, our walk, and how we apply those to us. When I was a young man, I guess I was high school age, I was riding with one of my friends when another friend pulled up behind us in a car that he had kind of got as a fast car. Now the car we were in was not fast at all. It was a pretty slow car. And the guy that pulled up behind us was in a car that was fast, and he was going to try to pass us because he thought that would be funny. Well, the guy that was driving the car that I was in blocked the road, made sure that he couldn't get by us. We were kind of traveling on country roads, back roads, that kind of thing. Going a lot faster than we should have been going, but the guy that was behind us, our friend, was kind of pushing us, and he thought it'd just be really funny to move on by our car. And this went on for some time, until we came to a portion of some of these back roads that we knew to be very windy, curvy, and dangerous. And me and another friend that was riding with us convinced our driver to, hey, let's just let him get on by if that's what he wants to do, because this could be bad. And so our friend thankfully had the smarts to back off of the speed. He pulled over and let the other guy fly by us, which he was more than happy to do, laughing all the way. He went down a hill and around a big curve, and I remember we heard the sounds of tires screeching, saw smoke rolling, and we thought, oh boy, man, that's something bad has happened. And when we rounded the corner, we saw the car that our friend was driving had slid completely sideways in the middle of the road, and had nearly hit a car that was turning in front of him to turn into a driveway. As he had rounded the corner, apparently, a car was turning into the driveway, and he was going way too fast and just about hit that car. Had that happened, it would have been likely an extraordinary accident with serious injuries or even worse. That kind of thing can only come from immaturity. The fact that he was an immature driver shows that he was going for the thrill and not thinking about the fact that he needed to drive in a responsible way to protect himself and others. And his foolish driving nearly cost him and perhaps another driver and their passenger a trip to the hospital, a stay in the hospital, or even worse. Immaturity can be difficult. We talk to our kids knowing that sometimes they make poor decisions in their immaturity. And when they do, we have to reprimand them and instruct them as to what better choices might have been made in the situations they come into. So we have a pretty good view of what it looks like to be immature. We can see that in our world. We can see that sometimes in younger people. Sometimes we see it in older people. The fact that they just haven't gained the wisdom and the insight from the experiences they've had in living. And because of that, they generally are difficult people to be around. They're prone to make mistakes. They're prone to make bad choices, poor choices, choices that get them and others around them injured or in trouble. And because of that, we generally try to avoid those folks. We try to avoid the folks that just are going to fight the idea of maturity and what it is to mature in this world. Well, what does it look like as we think about this? What does it look like to be spiritually mature? How does one become spiritually mature? How do we grow in our faith to the point that we're making good decisions spiritually? Doing things that we know we ought to do because it's what God wants us to do, not because it's just what we want to do. And I think that's a good question, and it's one that we all need to ask, and we need to try to be a part of. We need to try to decide what would it look like to be spiritually mature, and how do we get there? What are some ways that we can get to spiritual maturity in our lives? Well, that's one of the things that the Hebrews author discusses when he talks about coming against the temptation to fall away or to back away from your faith. How do we gain spiritual maturity? So we're going to start reading in chapter 5. Just kind of remind you what happened at the end of chapter 4 when he talks about how Jesus is a great high priest. And he's able, because of his experiences of being fully human, he's able to experience and know what it is to live like we lived. He can empathize, verse 15 says in chapter 4, he can empathize with our weaknesses because he's been tempted just like we are. And so because of him and because of what he experienced and went through on our behalf, we now can approach the throne of grace with confidence. And that's what we do because of him. Jesus is our great high priest, and he is a greater high priest because God has made him so. Let's start with verse 1 of chapter 5. We'll read verses 1 through 4. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent people in the matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. That's why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming high priest. God, and he's going to go on to say that God gave him or called him to that high priesthood. So he's talking about the priesthood. You go back to the Old Testament, you know that the priests came through the line of Aaron. They were the Levitical priesthood, and the high priest, Aaron at one time, his sons at other times, and then on down the line. The high priest was the priest that was in charge. He was in charge of being sure that the things that they were doing were the right things to do. They were the things that God wanted them to do. That the services they were holding, the sacrifices they were making, the feasting they were doing, the fasting they were doing, all of the things that they did as Jews to serve God was being done in a correct way. And he led them and helped them in that situation. The high priest also made sacrifices for the people. He sacrificed for them so that their sins could be forgiven. That's what those sacrifices were for. And this is making the passage that because the priest is just a man and he's subject to weakness, he has to make sacrifices for his own sin too. And it says that the priest, because he's human, is able to understand the struggles that people deal with. Because he is weak, he understands our weakness, or he understands the weakness of the people, and therefore he can have empathy on their behalf. And he makes sacrifices for his own sin in verse 3. Then he goes in and saying that Jesus was also called by God to be a high priest, just like Aaron was. But the point he'll be making is that Jesus was a greater high priest. Let's read verse 5 again. In the same way, Christ did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, "You are my son, and today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Interesting things that he quotes here and he talks about here, talking about Jesus being called to be a high priest, that he didn't automatically become high priest when he came here on earth, but he was called to be the high priest, and because his suffering made him perfect, made him a perfect candidate for becoming a high priest. He quotes a couple of passages from the Psalms. First of all, he quotes Psalms 2:7 when he says, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And there, the psalmist is talking about how God made the king his son and gave him a place of honor, and saying you need to respect God's son. And in Psalm 110, where in verse is quoted in verse 6 here in chapter 5, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." And there he's talking about how God lifted the king and exalted the king. Messianic prophecies, no doubt. The writer of Hebrews certainly saw them that way. And it's clear that he's saying that God elevated Jesus. That God elevated Jesus. God made him his son and called him his son. So not only was he the high priest, but he was also the Son of God. And then he talked about Jesus' suffering, the fact that Jesus can relate to our sufferings because he himself suffered. In fact, he cried out to God in his times of suffering. We know he did in the Garden of Gethsemane. If there are other sufferings that the author here is talking about, I'm not sure, but certainly the Garden of Eden, he asked God to save him from death. And it was a time where it was where you can see through with the sweat drops of blood and the way he was praying that there was some extreme suffering going on there. He says the Son learned obedience through suffering. And through suffering, he was made perfect. That's really important. He's saying, remember, he's talking to a group of people who are themselves going through suffering. They have a lot of pressure from the community, the culture around them to make some changes. And if they don't, rejection is sure to follow. And so because of that, the author's having to say, listen, you need to know that Jesus suffered too, but through his sufferings, he was made perfect. Saying there that if you allow the suffering that you're going through to work on you, it can help you to become more like Jesus as well. Endure suffering. Allow that. Be patient in suffering. Endure suffering. Allow that to happen, because through it we become like Jesus. That's one way that we become mature, is by allowing and enduring the suffering that's a part of the lives of every believer, of every faithful person of Christ. Suffering is going to be a part of that lifestyle. We'll talk about that more here in just a minute. In verse 10, he quotes the idea of Jesus becoming a high priest through the order of Melchizedek. David claimed that first there in the Psalm, that he became the high priest through the order of Melchizedek. You remember Melchizedek was the king of Salem, or what came to be known as Jerusalem, during the time of Abraham. And Abraham had an encounter with Melchizedek. It says that Melchizedek was also a priest of God. He was a priest king and served Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham. And they served the same God, and Abraham gave tribute to Melchizedek at that point in time. And so not a lot is said about him. Hebrews maybe says more about him than the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament combined. And we're going to run into the Hebrew author talking about Melchizedek in chapter 7. So we're not going to go any further there, just to help us to understand who he's talking about here when he says he was made a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that's important. Jesus obeyed God. His obedience led to his suffering. Through his suffering, he was made perfect. And as he was made perfect, he was exalted. And that's the path the Hebrews author wants us to take as well. Suffering to become and to be made perfect, to be made more and more and more like Jesus. Then the author takes a turn towards the audience, talking about maturity, talking about how perfection makes one mature, and talking about how the members of his audience apparently are resisting the suffering or the persecution. They're, instead of engaging in the persecution and allowing that to happen, they're allowing it to change their faith so that they shrink back and they blend in with the crowd. And it's exactly that the author is encouraging them not to do. It's exactly what he says, that's not what you want to do. And so he's saying that you need to if you're to be like Jesus, you need to stay active. You need to stay focused on Jesus and move through the persecution and allow that to have its impact. Listen to what he says when they've resisted the persecution, when they've avoided suffering and persecution. He's saying that there's going to be a cost to that. Listen to what he says here, starting in verse 11. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, still being an infant, is not acquainted with the teachings about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Well, I imagine the audience that read this, at least for some of them who had been avoiding the persecution, some of them who had kind of been closet Christians or taken a step back from Christianity altogether, that had to be a little bit hurtful. Saying that by now you should be more mature than this. You should be more mature than to allow persecution to affect your faith the way it has. And yet, we are where we are. Some of you, he said, are still taking milk for nourishment, spiritually speaking, when you should be taking solid food. It's the case of people who are always consuming but never applying. It's the case of people who come to church gatherings and stay there for years and years and years, always consuming but never applying. Calling themselves a Christian but never looking more and more and more like Jesus. In that situation, we have people even today who have been Christians for years but are still taking milk and not solid food. They haven't allowed the application of the principles Jesus taught in their lives to produce the kind of pushback that it does from culture and to allow it to create the persecution which creates perfection, which allows that person to be exalted. He says solid food is for the mature. And solid food not only includes hard teaching about righteousness, but it also includes being able to endure the persecution around them so that they can also grow from it. They can mature through the experiences that they have, and that's going to be really important. He points out that Jesus went through suffering, and so because Jesus went through suffering, we also should be willing to go through suffering. And again, that's what we're seeing the Hebrews audience avoiding. They're simply not going through the suffering. They're falling away. Well, how do we think, in application, how do we think the church is doing about this today? How do we think the church is doing when it comes to suffering, when it comes to withstanding the pressure of culture to make changes? How are they doing? Are they slipping back, fading into culture? Well, I think sometimes we can see that they are. I mean, one of two things is happening. Either they're cuddling up with culture and kind of staying close to the cultural idols and calling the cultural idols okay, assuming that teaching and assuming that God accepts the idols of culture when we know that He doesn't. Or they're separating and isolating completely and criticizing culture and being harsh with culture and unloving with culture. Both of those are wrong. They're wrong approaches to dealing with it. One can either, when it comes to the pressure that culture puts on us, we can either try to blend in, or we can take that harsh separatist approach and scream loudly at the other, like a lot of other voices do, saying, well, you're the ones who are wrong. But that's not what we've been told to do. We've been told that we are people who are to move into culture but not become a part. We're to be in the world but not of the world. And so while we move in the world to become more and more of what God wants us to be, the pressure is going to be applied. But the more we differentiate, the more we show that we're going to live the lifestyle that God's called us to live, regardless of the pressure and regardless of the consequences that cause, then it causes us to look different. We're going to stand out. It's like Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 when he says you need to live like aliens and strangers or foreigners in the land in which you live. Stand out. If it means that people treat you harshly, or if it means that there are consequences socially or even from the government, then you need to accept that. Because it's through that people see Jesus, and some will choose to live like they lived. Mature Christians have to teach the truth in love. They have to show others their love while not blending in and doing the things that they do. People will never hear the truth if they don't see our love, and that is the truth. We've got to be lovingly giving the truth to them, showing them truth, and we need to be mature spiritually so that we can do that, so that we can demonstrate to them how Jesus lived and encourage them to live in the same ways. We have a series of classes that we're teaching on spiritual maturity. It's also found on our YouTube channel. It's called Spiritual Formation. There are a few classes up. We're adding more all the time. But this class is on how to become more spiritually mature. So I encourage you to go over and check those classes out as well and follow them as we unfold those on our YouTube channel. Think in terms of what it is to become spiritually mature. Clearly, the Hebrews author is saying that's what God wants. He wants us. He doesn't want us to be people who are Christians for a long time and still taking mother's milk. We need to be Christians who are engaging the culture in the way that we're to engage it. We're withstanding persecution when we're called to, and letting others know the truth in Jesus' love. That's what we're called to do. That's what He's calling them to do, and what we're called to do today as well. Hey, next time we'll get together, we'll talk about chapter 6 of Hebrews. I thank you for hanging with us through this, and we'll look forward to seeing you again the next time.